There's a common assumption that when someone cuts you off without explanation, they must be angry, immature, or simply cruel, that they owe you a conversation. That walking away in silence is a form of cowardice dressed up as dignity. But that assumption reveals more about the observer than it does about the empath who walked away. Because for many empaths, the silence that follows a disconnection is not coldness, it is not punishment, it is not even necessarily permanent, it is often the most self-aware, most carefully considered decision they have ever made. And psychology has a very specific, very precise explanation for why deeply sensitive people sometimes disappear without a single word. And once you understand it, you will never misread that silence the same way again. Most people have been conditioned to believe that every ending requires a conversation. That closure is something you owe to anyone who demands it. That leaving without explanation is emotional immaturity dressed up as independence. And in some cases, that belief has merit. But empaths operate from a fundamentally different psychological architecture. They do not process relationships the way most people do. They do not simply feel emotions, they absorb them. They carry them. They spend years metabolizing the emotional weight of other people's unresolved pain, unspoken resentment, and unconscious manipulation. And by the time an empath goes silent, something very specific has already happened inside them. Something that most people on the outside will never fully understand. Because the silence you are witnessing is not the beginning of the story. It is the final chapter of one that was never told aloud. Hughes, one of the most respected behavioral analysts and human behavior experts alive today, has spent years studying how highly perceptive individuals process relationships differently from the general population. And what emerges from that research is both striking and uncomfortable. Empaths are not simply more emotional than other people. They are more observant. They are reading the emotional architecture of every interaction in real time. They are detecting patterns others miss entirely. They are sensing motivations that lie beneath the surface of spoken words. And they are tracking energy shifts, behavioral inconsistencies, and relational undercurrents that most people never consciously register at all. Which means by the time an empath goes silent, they have often already had the conversation 100 times inside their own mind. They have already rehearsed every response. They have already felt the weight of every possible outcome. And they have arrived at a conclusion that required no further discussion. The only remaining act of self-respect was the one that asked for no audience. This is where most people fundamentally misread the empath's silence. They interpret it as punishment. They interpret it as anger. They interpret it as manipulation in reverse, a power play wrapped in quiet. But it is almost never that. What the silence actually represents is something far more psychologically sophisticated. It represents protection. Not protection from the other person necessarily, though sometimes that too, but protection of something the empath has spent years trying to preserve and rebuild inside themselves. Their peace, their energy, their sense of self, their capacity to feel without being consumed. Because empaths who cut people off without explaining have almost always crossed a threshold that outsiders never witnessed them approaching. A point where the cost of continued engagement finally exceeded their capacity to absorb it. And that threshold is never reached quickly. It is reached after years of over-explaining, over-forgiving, extending, and receiving in return something that consistently failed to honor the depth of what was offered. Think about what that actually means experientially. An empath does not reach silence after one conversation. They reach it after 1,000. They reach it after explaining themselves in 10 different ways and still not being heard. They reach it after forgiving the same behavior repeatedly because they genuinely believe the other person was capable of better. They reach it after making themselves endlessly available, endlessly understanding, endlessly compassionate, and discovering over and over again that their availability was being consumed rather than appreciated. Their understanding was being exploited rather than reciprocated. Their compassion was being used as a door that never needed to be locked because it was always assumed to be open. And at some point, the empath quietly realizes something that changes everything. The door was never being honored, it was simply being used. And here is where the psychology becomes truly extraordinary. Because the empath who walks away in silence is not operating from impulse. They are not reacting from a moment of anger or wounded pride. They are operating from pattern recognition that has been running in the background of their awareness for months, sometimes years. They have observed long enough to know that certain people do not change, not because they lack the capacity, but because they lack the motivation. They have watched certain dynamics repeat themselves with different words but identical emotional outcomes. They have extended trust that was returned damage. They have offered honesty that was twisted into ammunition. And once that pattern becomes undeniable, the empath stops engaging with the performance of resolution. They stop attending the theater of conversation that produces feeling without change. And they begin practicing something far more powerful: acceptance without announcement, departure without debate, creates healing without permission. There is an assumption buried in our culture that says the mature response to conflict is always direct communication, and in many situations that is true. But maturity is not a single behavior. Maturity is the wisdom to recognize which situations call for which response. And empaths, after enough experience, learn something that contradicts conventional relational advice. There are certain people and certain dynamics where direct communication does not produce understanding, it produces escalation. Radiates. There are certain explanations that will not be received as honesty, they will be received as invitation. An invitation to negotiate, to reframe, to manipulate. The empath doubt what they already know with perfect clarity. And once an empath understands this, silence stops being avoidance. It becomes strategy, not a cold or calculated strategy, but a self-preserving one. The strategy of someone who finally understands that not every battlefield deserves their presence. Now, there is another layer here that almost no one considers. Radiates. And it may be the most important layer of all. Empaths who cut people off without explaining are often protecting the other person too, in ways that will never be acknowledged. Radiates. In ways that will never even be suspected. Because the truth an empath carries in those final moments of silence is often devastating. They have seen things clearly. Radiates. They have understood dynamics that the other person is not ready to face. And they know with the quiet certainty of deep perception that delivering that truth will not liberate the other person. Radiates. It will only create destruction dressed up as honesty. So they choose something harder. They choose mercy over accuracy. They choose distance over devastation. They choose to absorb the discomfort of being misunderstood, being called cold, being called cowardly, being called cruel. Radiates, rather than leaving behind the kind of wreckage that would follow full transparency. And that kind of quiet sacrifice is one of the most misread acts of emotional maturity that exists in human relationships. People always focus on what the empath took away when they left. The conversation, the explanation, the closure. But very few people ask what the empath was carrying when they walked out, the weight of what they chose not to say. Radiates the burden of protecting someone who would never know they were being protected, the loneliness of holding a truth that could not be shared without causing harm, and that loneliness is real. It is one of the defining experiences of the deeply perceptive. They often know too much to speak freely, and so they carry it silently. And sometimes that silent carrying looks like abandonment to the people who are left behind. What unsettles people most about the empath who cuts them off is not the leaving itself. Radiates. Human beings understand endings. What unsettles them is the silence attached to the leaving, because silence cannot be argued with. It cannot be reframed. It cannot be manipulated through emotional negotiation. It cannot be dismantled through guilt. And for people who have built their influence over the empath through words, through persistent pressure, through the emotional leverage of demanding explanation and apology and proof of care, that silence is profoundly disorienting. It removes every tool that was previously effective. Radiates. The dynamic that once operated on the empaths need to be understood, to be accepted, to be seen as good and kind and reasonable. That dynamic suddenly has nothing to grab onto. And the person who was once the anchor in that exchange begins to feel untethered in a way they cannot fully articulate. Because the empath who was once endlessly available, endlessly forgiving, endlessly willing to try once more, is no longer present for the negotiation, and that shift feels from the outside like punishment. But from the inside, it feels like the first real breath of air in years. This is the part that psychology finds most fascinating, because what looks like cutting someone off is not merely a social act. It is a neurological and psychological event inside the empath. It is the moment the nervous system finally stops bracing for impact. It is the moment the internal monitoring system, that constant background process that has been tracking another person's mood, reactions, approval, and disapproval at enormous energetic cost, finally powers down. And what follows is not triumph. It is not revenge. It is something far quieter and far more significant. It is relief. Deep, disorienting, sometimes grief-saturated relief. Because even when a relationship has been painful, the ending of it still involves loss. And empaths feel that loss fully. They do not cut people off because they stopped caring. They cut people off because they cared so much for so long. It's at such enormous personal cost that continuing became incompatible with survival. And this brings us to something Hughes identifies as one of the most misunderstood behavioral signatures of the highly perceptive individual. Ability to grieve someone while simultaneously refusing to return to them. Most people interpret this as contradictory. If you miss someone, you go back. If you still care, you maintain contact. Radiates, but empaths understand that love and wisdom are not always in conflict with each other when they result in distance. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to participate in a dynamic that is harming both of you. Sometimes the most caring act available is the one that looks from the outside, indifference. And empaths often choose that act quietly, painfully, without ever receiving credit for the courage it required. Because it does require courage, enormous courage, to be misunderstood, the courage to be labeled cold, distant, immature, or cruel by people who never witnessed what preceded the silence. Radiates the courage to carry the weight of their own healing without outsourcing it to the person who caused the wound. and the courage to trust their own perception at a time when every voice around them may be suggesting they give it one more chance, have one more conversation, offer one more explanation. Yates. Empaths who cut people off without explaining have often already had that conversation inside themselves, and they have already heard every argument, and they have already decided, not from stubbornness, Yates, from exhaustion, from wisdom, from the deep knowing that comes only after you have tried every available option and watched them all arrive at the same destination. Yates. There is also a dimension here that touches on something psychologically profound about identity. Radiates. Empaths who have lived in chronically difficult relationships often experience something that researchers describe as self-dissolution. Yates. A gradual erosion of the self that happens so slowly it is almost imperceptible in real time. They begin to lose track of where their own feelings end and someone else's begin. Yates. They begin organizing their behavior around managing another person's emotional state rather than honoring their own. They begin shrinking, accommodating, adjusting, Yates, disappearing piece by piece into the project of maintaining peace in an environment that was never actually peaceful. And by the time they walk away, they are often walking away from more than a relationship. They are walking away from a version of themselves that they can no longer afford to be, a version that was too available, too forgiving. Radiates, too willing to translate pain into patience indefinitely, and the silence that accompanies that walking away is not empty, it is full. Radiates, it is full of everything that was never said and never received and never honored. It is full of the conversations that were had but not heard, the apologies that were offered but not changed. Yates, the boundaries that were stated and then violated so consistently they cease to function as boundaries at all. The silent cutting off is not the absence of communication. Radiates, it is the final form that communication takes when all other forms have been exhausted. It is the statement that requires no words because the words were already spoken repeatedly without effect. Now it is important to distinguish here between the empath who cuts people off as a pattern of avoidance and the empath who cuts people off as a product of genuine discernment. Radiates, because not every departure without explanation represents psychological health. Some people use silence as a weapon, some use it as a control mechanism. Yet some disappear because confrontation feels intolerable and silence feels safer, not because they have made a wise and considered decision, but because they lack the capacity for direct communication. That pattern is different. It operates from fear, not clarity, and it tends to repeat itself across every relationship regardless of the health of the dynamic. Radiates, but the empath operating from genuine discernment is recognizable by a different signature. They do not cut everyone off. They are not chronically disappearing. Yates, they have not built a life around strategic withdrawal. They have instead reached a specific threshold with a specific person or dynamic after a specific accumulation of experience. Radiates, and their silence is targeted, it is chosen, and it is almost always preceded by a long period of the opposite, of trying, of staying, of forgiving. Radiates, of extending chances that most people would have withdrawn long before. The discerning empath does not leave quickly. They leave thoroughly, and when they go completely. Yates, because they have already done the work of returning 100 times, and they know what waits for them there. And perhaps this is what we most need to understand about that kind of departure. Yates, it is not impulsive, it is not punitive, it is not evidence of emotional dysfunction. Yates, it is often the single most emotionally intelligent act available in a situation where every other option has been tried and found inadequate. It is the act of someone who has finally chosen themselves. It's not against the other person, but for themselves, and that distinction matters enormously, because choosing yourself is not the same as rejecting someone else. It is the recognition that your peace, Yates, your stability, your psychological integrity has value, not because you decided it does in a moment of anger, but because experience has taught you what it costs when you treat it as though it does not. Yates, there is one more truth buried in all of this that people never reach, and it may be the most important. When an empath cuts someone off without explaining, the explanation they withhold is rarely about cruelty or cowardice. It is almost always about self-knowledge. Specifically, it is the knowledge that the explanation would not be received as intended. Radiates. It would be analyzed for weakness. It would be used as a starting point for renegotiation. It would invite a response designed not to understand but to re-engage. Yates. And the empath knows this because they have watched it happen before. They know how the conversation would unfold, not because they are cynical, but because they are perceptive. And perception radiates. When it reaches a certain depth, stops being speculation, it becomes recognition. And you cannot know what you have recognized. So the silence is not withholding. The silence is wisdom applied. It is the recognition that some truths do not need to be spoken to be real. It is the understanding that some endings do not require ceremony to be complete. It is the quiet knowledge that walking away fully is sometimes more honest than any explanation could be. Because explanations can be debated, explanations can be reframed. Radiates. Explanations give the other person something to hold on to, something to respond to. something to use as a foothold back into the dynamic. But silence is complete. It is a door that closes entirely. Yates. And for an empath who has spent years unable to fully close that door, that completeness is not cruelty. It is the beginning of recovery. And maybe this is what the world needs to hear most clearly. If someone walked away from you in silence, the explanation you are searching for was not withheld from cruelty. It was withheld from clarity. Yates. It was withheld because the empath already knew what you would do with it. Radiates. It was withheld because they had finally learned to protect what was sacred rather than offer it to someone who had already demonstrated they could not honor it. The silence is not the message. Radiates. The silence is what happens when someone has finally stopped sending messages to an address that was never truly home. And for the empath who walks away, that silence is not an ending. It is a return. Radiates. A return to peace. A return to the kind of quiet that has nothing to prove and no one to perform for. And in a world that constantly demands explanation, justification radiates. And proof of feeling, choosing that silence may be the most radical act of self-possession available. Because the moment you stop explaining yourself to people who were never truly listening, you begin to hear yourself again. And for an empath who has spent years drowning in the noise of other people's needs, that sound, the sound of their own clarity returning, is not small. It is everything.